I want women to start thinking of romancing themselves, whatever that means. Thinking about self-pleasure, and whether that means, like, again, I can't say. I think this is that deep dive. What brings you deep pleasure for an afternoon is not the same that's going to bring me pleasure or someone else. And it might not even mean sexual. But I think when we get back to ourselves and we feel filled up by ourselves, we're more open to inviting pleasure in, however that looks like, with our partners. So the answers are like, how do I spice up my sex life? It's so complicated. There's no 5 easy ways, but I do have some suggestions.
Well, now, Sid.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life.
So, Find Your Pleasure. It started with a blog, Sin, and now has become this beautiful book. Tell us about the beginning, about thinking that this was possible and then bringing it to fruition.
So, yeah, I've shared this story on the show, but in case you haven't heard it, it's also shared in the book. When we launched the show in 2013, I was a brand new mom. I'd just given birth in May of that same year. And I was kind of still relatively new at TV in front of the camera work, period. I'd done one other show, spent many years before that behind the scenes as a producer. And this show was a very exciting thing. There were lots of eyeballs on it. People were super excited about it in the company. People were excited about it out in the world. And I was really proud and happy to be on it. But when I was really honest with myself in the quiet moments of my life, I was this new mom kind of still figuring stuff out. I was pumping my boobs at work every day. I was sleep deprived. I had this great supportive partner at home, but in those quiet moments, I realized that I was kind of quietly suffering. I mean, and I say that, it's like suffering is maybe too dramatic of a word, but I didn't feel good about my life. And I was also then felt feeling crappy about my life, because here I had all these wonderful things happening. And I was trying to figure out what's going on. And what I sort of came to was that I couldn't remember the last time I had done anything for me. I was moving through my life in this kind of rat race. It was like, oh, I gotta do this, I've got this to-do list, must put up my thank you cards for the baby
Everything
shower.
was a schedule.
Everything was a schedule. And then I was also drowning in kind of mother guilt. And I'd lost a certain part of myself, or maybe many parts. It all came to a head one day in a story that I share in the book. And long story short, it was a kind of wake-up call for me. And when I started reaching out to girlfriends, a lot of them said the same thing. And for some reason, the word pleasure came to mind. Like, I couldn't remember something I'd done that was indulgent. And so that became this sort of process where I started embarking on, what is pleasure? And what can I start to do to reinvigorate it in my life? And what's the way in which we all think about pleasure, and why has it been kind of maligned in society? And so I started this website called Find Your Pleasure, and then eventually it came to writing this book. So that's kind of the Coles Notes of this. Are Coles Notes still a thing?
There's still a thing for me. Yeah, still a thing. So you couldn't remember the last time that you had indulged yourself. Your girlfriends couldn't remember the last time they had indulged themselves.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that they allowed others to feel pleasure in many ways, because as women, we take care of people. We're caregivers that way. Were there times throughout the process of writing this where you doubted yourself at all? Thought, am I actually going to get to the finish line?
Oh yeah, oh my God, yeah. I mean, I think that that's kind of a constant that most women that I know are constantly trying to push back on. It's that self-doubt, it's that questioning, it's that imposter syndrome that you have, where you're like, do I have something that actually is meaningful to say? Will this work out in the way that I want it to? Will people receive this message? How will it be criticized? I've actually wrote a piece recently on my blog that it was about the feelings that I was feeling leading up to launching it. Because I mean, people say, oh, it's like you at birth a baby. It's not quite. There's not as many stitches. There's not as much blood. But it is a process of putting something out in the world that you care about deeply. But in a weird way, it's more vulnerable, because everyone sees a baby and they're like, oh, it's so beautiful, it's so perfect, it's so cute. Whereas you put a book out and you're sort of, you get a little bit worried that part of your heart is going to be out there and maybe not received. But it honestly has been a really, not to sound obvious, but like a pleasure-filled experience. I had an amazing team at Simon & Schuster, and my editors, Lori Grassi and Sarah St. Pierre, were incredible. There's just a team there that really made this a very enjoyable experience. Because that was the whole point. If it wasn't going to be pleasurable to write it, what in the hell was the point?
What's the point, right? What is even the point?
Yeah.
That word pleasure, though, is fraught with a lot.
Yeah.
It's a loaded thing, especially for women. It is, right? Because when you think pleasure, it's almost a bad word.
Yeah.
Right? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. Even as soon as I tried to get the URL for my website, Find Your Pleasure, it had previously been owned by, I don't even know what it was, but all I knew is that we were immediately blocked on. We were trying to get ads for things, and people were like, I don't know what. So it was some kind of
XXX rated.
It might have been. So,
Yeah.
and it dawned on me, just doing even quick Google searches, how often pleasure is associated with sex in a very kind of tawdry sort of way, not in a celebratory way, not in a curious way. And then I thought about it in my own life, the ways in which we talk about things like, we say guilty pleasures or, forbidden pleasures. And there was even this one thing I found when I Googled, there was like a JPEG that said something like, happiness is, bliss, and pleasure is like, it was like the pleasure is like the lesser version. I can't remember exactly what it said. But I do think part of this is this puritanical background that many of us were raised in. How many people were raised with sort of a religious backdrop? Like, I was raised Catholic, right? And for sure with Catholics, there's a real like...
It's carnal.
Yeah, it's this carnal thing.
Yeah.
It's also like you're supposed to really be balanced. Like, you don't want to, indulge too much because it's like this slippery slope to like hell.
Right. Yes.
And again, I wouldn't. One of the things that I think is important to say is that I don't think it's that there aren't certain pleasures when, done flippantly or done maybe even if we're not being completely honest with ourselves, can't be dangerous. But what I will say is the more in which we repress certain natural instincts, the more in which we repress our inner voices, the more in which we repress our desires without even question, I think that's when we get into trouble more often. And that's why I want people to think more deeply about pleasure in all realms of life, but including sex.
How would you define pleasure? What is it?
I think pleasure is activating your senses. It is really paying close attention to what you see, what you smell, what you hear, what you touch, and what you taste. And going back to the original story of how this kind of came to be, what I realized was, hi. Sorry, I'm just realizing I'm seeing people that I know in the audience. What I realized was that I was kind of living, sleepwalking through my life. That I was spending a lot of time with my face buried in my phone. That I was spending a lot of time inside my own head, thinking about my to-do lists. And that I was really not present in my body. And so, to me, that's about pleasure is about experiencing life in all of its fullness. It's about making choices in the smallest of ways to think about what we put on our bodies, what we put into our bodies, what we surround ourselves to look at. Those are the kind of small, fine details of pleasure. But then there's the big things that bring us pleasure. They are our goals that we want to meet. They are the people that we choose to spend time with. They are the ways in which we choose to use our voice and let other people into our lives. These are all different ways we activate pleasure. And I think we know pleasure when we feel it. We know that feeling. And to me, it is distinct from happiness, although in a Venn diagram, they would overlap.
You've got to be deliberate, though, about seeking out pleasure, don't you? Like, it just, sometimes I guess you can attain pleasure, from other people and things they say or do and that kind of thing. But as far as finding your own pleasure, you've got to be really deliberate. You've got to set your mind to it. It is a mindset in many ways.
I think it is a mindset. I think we can make choices every day in our life to see the world through the lens that we want to. And I'm not going to lie. Like, there are still days that I wake up when I'm like, the lens is crusty, and I'm seeing things, and I have to really actively make a choice to remember all the things that do bring me deep pleasure, and actually scheduling time for them, and not just thinking, like, again, because my go-to position, and I think many women that I know, men too, I'm not excluding you from this, put themselves on the back burner or even further back, I was trying to reprioritize myself. And if that was going to look selfish, I was kind of okay with that because I needed to. I needed to do that. I needed to do it to save my marriage. I needed to do it to be a better mother. I needed to do it to be more authentic with myself and honest. So when you say about getting into, I intentionally making it, it is about carving out time. Like, I think about all the things that we spend time thinking about. If we're going to plan a dinner party, how much time and energy we put into delighting our friends. We think about the menu, and we think about what we're going to get, and we fill our homes with the right. We don't do this kind of thing. We don't turn that kind of attention on ourselves very often. That would seem silly or superfluous, and I think we'd be wise to think more about the ways in which we can delight and surprise ourselves and be curious about ourselves.
Curiosity is a huge thing, right?
Yes.
Tell me more about that. The whole idea, the pleasure of being curious and new adventure and delving into things that you've not ever delved into before and finding yourself by doing so.
The process, I would say one of the things I write a lot about in this book is parenting. And anybody who's close to children or has a child in their life is you watch the way that they maneuver through life, and they experience it through their senses. Like, they pick up everything, they touch everything, they say whatever's on their mind. And we start to lose this as we go through life. And I share this, if anyone's seen the movie Knocked Up, Paul Rudd's character at one point says, I wish I liked anything as much as my kids like bubbles. Yeah. and that struck me when I was watching that movie. It's just it's true. They're a reminder. I watched my son once just sort of stare at this leaf and play with this leaf for a long period of time. And they are reminders of how shitty sorry for my language, but how bad we've become at seeing the world in its beauty. And being curious about the world, and being fearless about asking questions about it. So, for me, this process of writing the book was also mining my own life. And these little gifts happened. So this one day, I was driving to work, and I did what everybody does, and I'm trying to change this now. Go to work the same exact route every single day, right? Do the same thing, rinse, repeat, same activities. So I was doing that thing, and I was driving by. This is early stages of writing this book. And I saw these posters up on the wall. And they all said, pleasures of living. Handwritten posters, okay? With a whole list of things. And I would drive by and I go what the hell is that? Who wrote that? What is this? Eventually one day I decided screw it. I am pulling over and I'm going to get this. And I took photographs and I put them in the book. They're kind of eroded though because I waited too long. The weather had gotten to them. But what I could see on them is some wonderful soul who I hope to meet one day had decided to declare what they thought the pleasures of living should be. And they included everything from home-baked bread to a kind, country-loving boyfriend to soft sheets. These little tiny things, and some of them were bigger, and kindness, all these different things. And it was just I've been thinking about this. And when you start to think about things, you start to see the world differently. You start to put on your curious lens, and then suddenly more interesting things start to come your way. At least that's been my experience. So I try to, and as much as possible, approach every day with a sense of curiosity and play. Yeah. Sorry, one other thing. There's this woman named Sister Corita Kent that I think I share a story about. She was a nun in the 60s in San Francisco, and she wrote really inspiring things about art and the importance of art. But this one expression that she came up with was called plorking. And it sounds kind of rude, but it's actually this combination of the word play and working. And her belief was that we should all be plorking more and going into our spaces and thinking of them as opportunities for play. And if your workspace isn't carved out for that, then you make the time for play in your workspace because it makes you a better, more creative worker and a better person.
You mentioned your son Jaya and how kids play, how he plays and what you learn from that. You dedicated your book to Jason and Jaya. Yeah. A couple lessons, other than the one that you shared with us already, about Jaya and what he's taught you through this process. Because this has really been a rebirth for you, Cyn, in many ways.
Yeah. I wasn't sure I wanted to be a parent. Let's just start with that. For years, I was not interested, didn't, and I hit my 30s and sort of things started to change. And man, that whole process, I write a lot about the varying processes of parenting. One thing I write about a lot was that I never expected the process of pregnancy to feel, and again, I'm not saying this is universal, but it was a really interesting, life-changing experience for me, that I did feel was filled with a lot of anxiety, but also a lot of pleasure. The process of parenting, someone once described to me as like putting your heart on the outside of your body and just sort of walking around. And it's not always the most comfortable feeling. But I think it connects us in ways. I think because I cry at the drop of a hat now. Yeah. I wasn't like that before. And I think I include a piece about this too. I was like an ice queen who never cried. For years and years and years, I did not cry. I could have bottled up my emotions, again, talking about that burying thing. And having a child, I became leaky with emotion. Like, I feel like my breasts were leaking, like vagina was leaking, face was leaking, everything was leaking all around. And I think it was something that I needed to do, because what has happened in that process, it's not always the best feeling, it's not always the most pleasurable feeling, but it has made me more empathetic, and that is a pleasure for me, yeah.
And Jason, your partner of almost 20 years, you're very different. I might say that. I'll just throw that out there. Cyn is outgoing, friendly. Not that Jason isn't friendly. I think he's just more shy and brilliant and creative, but he's introverted. Yeah. So very, very just. It's so interesting to watch the two of you. Yeah. But it works, right? And works well. But there are also lessons along the way. There are times it hasn't worked. You've been very, very open about that. Talk to me about relationships and finding pleasure even when you don't want to.
Well, I mean, there's so many places to go with that. Like, Jason is very different from me, and I think that's kind of why it works. I don't think complete opposites work. You have to have some baseline similarities. And I think where we are the same is our love for laughter and our love for adventure and travel. And I think we speak a similar language when it comes to our careers, because he's in a similar field. But as I write a relationship advice column, people come to me a lot. And one of the most common questions I get from people is, how do I keep the spice going in long-term relationships? This is something that I probably get once a week. And in a weird way, it breaks my heart, because I feel like part of the story that no one talks about is that long-term relationships are not like a Hollywood romance. There's a reason why they end. When they, at the time, it's like Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan got together, and then you don't see anything else that happens after that. Because long-term relationships it's not that they can't be pleasurable work, but they are work, and sometimes they're very hard work. And when it comes to spicing up the relationship, one of the things that I think that often happens is that women are the ones who are writing in this question to me. And they think they need to keep things spicy for their partners. And this kind of breaks my heart. I'm going to share a small story as a sideline. This isn't to do with Jason and me, but I remember a girlfriend of mine got pregnant, and one of the things that she was sharing with me was her anxiety around her husband and how her relationship with him was going to change. Nothing wrong with that. It's a valid concern. But when she kept talking, she said, I feel like I'm going to have a lot of attention on the baby, and I'm not going to be able to be there for him sexually speaking. And I was like, who cares? And it's not to say that I don't care. Of course I care. I care that people's I care about intimacy. But I think, unfortunately, the way that women and men have been raised is for women to discount their pleasure, and we can get into this deeply, and put it, again, on the back burner and not think about it. And men, unfortunately, often get taught that the only way that they can connect intimately is through sex. So we've got two opposite things pushing and pulling at the same time. Women who've been told to repress, be a good girl, don't get into that, you'll be this type of girl. And so that impacts the way that they see their sexuality. And men who've been told that as soon as anybody touches them like this, well, it's get it on, let's get it on, right? And that becomes this pressure on the woman. So there's this kind of push and pull that nobody is talking about. And so again, with the book, part of me, what I want to do is start us breaking down and changing, hopefully, the way that women think about themselves. And I think this starts young. I think this starts as small as making sure that we teach kids the proper names for genitals. Penis and vagina are not analogous. Penis and vulva are. And why is this important? Because the vagina is a birthing canal. The vulva includes her pleasure parts, the pleasure center, the clitoris, which is only there. It has no other purpose. None, except for pleasure. And I didn't learn about this growing up. And I think to eradicate that, like to just erase it from our own self-knowledge, erodes a sense of empowerment right from the earliest stages. And I know for me, I was raised also in an environment where you don't touch yourself, you don't talk about, you don't do any of that. So I grew up with all this kind of shame and questions that, again, you bury it because you don't want to be that type of girl. And again, I have a lot of empathy for men and the way that they're raised and what they're taught, but I think we have to come together, and one of the places that we need to do is, it does involve, and it's become a buzzword, but self-care. I want women to start thinking of romancing themselves, whatever that means. Thinking about self-pleasure, and whether that means, like, again, I can't say, I think this is that deep dive. What brings you deep pleasure for an afternoon is not the same that's going to bring me pleasure or someone else. And it might not even mean sexual. But I think when we get back to ourselves and we feel filled up by ourselves, we're more open to inviting pleasure in, however that looks like with our partners. So the answer to, like, how do I spice up my sex life is so complicated. There's no 5 easy ways, but I do have some suggestions.
Well, now, Sid, I want to get back to the whole idea of what we tell ourselves, how we speak to ourselves, and how that really can block our pleasure, right, and block our happiness. And I'm going to share a story. I'm going to share a story with you, because sometimes you wake up in the morning and you just feel like crap, right? You just don't feel well. And we have a show, and we get on that show, and we smile. And sometimes, on the inside, we're not so happy, and that was me, I don't know, a couple of months ago. And I said to Sin, I feel gross, I just feel, I don't know.
You were thinking of going on the master cleanse, I feel like.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I was. I was like, ew, like I look gross, and I don't know, I didn't like the way I looked at all. Anyway.
Can you imagine this? But anyway, yes.
Well, it's true. So anyway, I said this to Sin. She said, stop the master cleanse right now. But she also started sending me all of these Instagram pictures of women who were beautiful and weren't particularly stick thin, and they were diverse. And I thought, you are a good friend. But then I also thought it's about the way we speak to ourselves. There isn't anybody that I cared about on this earth that I would say to, you're fat, you're this has to change, look at you can do better. But that's what I tell myself. And I think a lot of us are like that, and that blocks pleasure. There's stuff to work out, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah, where does that begin? I think it begins with our own it's that inner voice. It's that feeling that we're not going to measure up to some kind of predestined idea that we've put about ourselves. And again, I think that stuff starts way in childhood, and it's interesting to unpack. I had a similar experience too, though, where I was on the show. Someone tweeted at me and said, if you're gonna show off your arms, you better do some toning, girl. And I was just like, but this is what you get when you're, like, this is part of that, the deal. And so I remember thinking to myself, I was hurt initially, and then I was like, whatever, my arms do great things. Like, I had to really, again, these are those stories we tell ourselves. It's like, if you consistently agree with those stories and those narratives about yourself, it's like thought does create reality. Thought has an impact in both positive and negative direction. If we tell people you can fake it till you make it, and people do, the people will tell you tons of success stories where they just showed up and they did really well. I think the reverse is true too. If you're constantly telling yourself horrible things about your body, I think that it has an impact on your body, personally. So it is some deep-rooted stuff. Women get it from all angles constantly about what bodies should look like, what they should do. And I just try to remind myself, like, this, what does your body do? What does it feel like? Imagine if we saw ourselves through the lens of, what does my body feel like? Because your kids, another reminder, kids do this all the time. Kids don't give a shit what you look like. They want to touch you, they want to feel you, they want to hug you. And if we started to do that a little bit more to ourselves and just focus on that, I feel like it could open up tons of pleasure possibilities.
So many lessons to be learned from little people.
Yes.
Right? So many.
Totally.
There are people that ask us all the time, whether the five of us being the co-hosts on The Social, whether or not we're really friends, whether or not we're really that tight, and we are. And I was so pleased to see the picture of us in your book, Cyn, of our social sleepovers.
Yeah.
But this is also a point about pleasure, because we take time out. We take time out to share and to be together for a night or two. We get a hotel room, and we just play board games, hang out, talk, play music, do karaoke, you name it.
Yeah.
But we do it, and it helps, and it's therapeutic. Speak to that point of having friends, and friends that you can count on, and the pleasure factor there.
Oh, I think it's so incredibly important. And I will share, and I don't think she would mind, that photo that's in the book of us at the hotel night.
Yes.
We had set up the
my
photo
gosh.
because Melissa loves to be like the photo taker.
Yeah.
And so she set it up and she put a timer on it. And we'd taken a few different photos. And the one that's in the book, Jess Allen decided to fart right at the exact moment right before it went, which was just amazing. I love her so
And
much.
so we were laughing.
Yeah, we were laughing
laughing.
genuinely from that. So I do think, like, obviously it's a luxury, but I know so many people who will go out and they'll spend money on, like, let's say, a whole bunch of lottery tickets in a year. And if you calculated the amount of money that lottery tickets, and I'm not saying if that's your pleasure, go for it, but you're not going to win. But if you wanted to put all that together and treat yourself to either a solo hotel night, it doesn't have to be an expensive one, like $100. You can put together a night for yourself or with your girlfriends. It doesn't take much, and it does. I never started doing this until you guys. Yeah. I mean, I started like this has been a huge change for me because I have girlfriends, I have tight girlfriends, but this idea of it brings you back to your childhood as well.
It absolutely does.
And just to kind of be together and escape. But when I started doing it with you guys, it was also a reminder, my mother always, that was one of the things that she never lost sight of in her marriage. It has still never, is the importance of having your friends. Yeah. And I think you need that to balance out your life, and to share, and to be vulnerable, and to cry together, and to know that a certain group of people will always have your back. No matter what, that's a huge joy.
Jan Arden's also a really good friend.
Oh, yes, she is. Yeah.
And makes an appearance in the book as well when you're talking about soulmates and people souls that travel together. What's the saying that Jan has?
Yeah, so Jan had said early when we met, she's like, I believe that packs of souls tend to travel together. And it's like you've met people along your journey before. And I'm not a religious person, but I would consider myself spiritual and in awe of the kind of mysteries of life and humbled by that. And there is something to be said for that. I mean, we've all had it. You know, when you meet somebody and you just immediately, it's like almost like music, right? You harmonize together. And you can it's just like, have I known you all my life? Or you can't remember before? Everyone's nodding, yeah. Or even conversely, those people who you maybe were really close to as a child and you lost sight of and you run into them again and it's like no time has passed. What is that? What is that thing? And there is something so beautiful and joyful about that, and you got to hang on to that stuff. Because one of the things that I've also noticed is getting older is that, you know, our lives get busier.
They speed up.
They speed up. Shit, that's true,
They
right?
do.
The time thing. Yeah, so you got to hang on to those moments.
You spoke about your childhood and the way that you were raised. Have you had to, and I don't know if reprogram is a strong word, but have you had to reprogram or, I guess, phrase differently in your mind the stuff that you were taught or things that you were told as a young woman or a girl in order to fulfill the pleasure now?
Yes. Yeah, my family was great, and I credit them in the book, too. They taught me a lot about, my mother is an incredible prolific gardener. I write a piece about her garden and the way in which she knows, like, all these little flowers and then their names, and it's like this magical space. She knows how to indulge in pleasure. She's part of her church choir. She's, always has a glass of wine at 5 o'clock every night. Like, she's a pleasure seeker. My dad is, like, definitely a happy hedonist as well. Like, he's simple. He just likes his chips and his card games and his booze. So like they're definitely in touch with that. When it comes to though the sexual aspect, like my first job in television was at fashion television. And my mom was like, "Oh, my daughter works at fashion television. She works at fashion television." And then I got the job at Sex TV, and she was like, "She works in TV." So my poor Poor mom, though. I mean, that's a lot. It was a lot for her to, because the way that she was raised, you don't talk about that, you don't think about that. But my sister ended up getting pregnant unintentionally at the age of 18, and I was 16 at the time. And that was for sure like a light bulb moment, a catalyst for me, because I saw the very real impact of what happens when people don't talk and educate people about sex, young people about sex. Like, you end up with an entire life rerouted because she didn't have the tools or the confidence. There were two things going on with my sister. She didn't have the voice, and she didn't have the tools to change that. Now, obviously, life goes in a direction and things have been fine, but it was a real wake-up call for me. So my mom has had to deal with the constant, like, even when I was a kid, though, I remember saying, so Mom, you're Catholic, right? And she was like, yes. And I said, so you and Dad have only ever had sex twice for me and my sister? And so I was probably a real jerk when I was like a young teen. But I guess I was always trying to poke holes in, not in Catholicism per se, it was more in the ideas of contradictions and the ideas of allowing the space for curiosity. Mm-hmm. And slowly but surely, my mom has opened up a little bit more as we've become adults and been able to talk about these things. And I think she really genuinely is in support of this. She's in Florida right now. That's also her pleasure, so she's not here tonight. Yeah.
You grew up in Barrie.
Yes.
Ontario. Mm-hmm. And a lot has changed. I mean, Barrie, and then coming here to Toronto, and then the job as well, the jobs that you've had. Mm-hmm. And that took courage to do what you did, because I know your story, Cyn. You didn't want to be in front of the camera at all. You were basically forced in front of it. You wanted to produce, you wanted to write, do all those things. But if you are to really fulfill pleasure, the highest order, do you not have to have that courage? Do you not have to walk in fear just a little bit in order to attain it?
Yeah. It's funny, I was thinking about this because this past weekend, my son had a karate graduation and he was petrified. And he didn't want to go up on the stage where the kids were. And I saw myself in him because, like you said, I was terrified to do public speaking. I was terrified. I really was kind of forced. Do this. Try it out at least. And it has become now one of my greatest pleasures, the honor of being able to be on the social and do public speaking. But I had to go through this kind of like mile of hell to get to there. So it's an interesting thing to consider when it comes to pleasure. How much do we need, like if you have a calling inside of you, but it scares the hell out of you, how do you maneuver through that?
It's a good thing, isn't it? I mean, when you're scared, it's a good thing.
I think it's good. If you, like, because a lot of people say, there's all these expressions too, like if you're meant to do something, it will just happen, or it will like, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think, you know, not only do you have to work for things, whether they're relationships, whether they're dreams, you have to do a lot of work, but I do think sometimes it may be the moment when you're actually thinking, I suck, I maybe should give up, this is not gonna work out, I hate this. Maybe that's the time when you need to push forward the most. Jason actually gave me a piece of wisdom that I know Lori, my editor, really enjoyed this from working on the book together. I used to do belly dancing. I was a belly dancer for years, and I would do these.
So many talents.
Weird, bizarre, pleasures in life to lead you in weird directions. But I used to do these weird late night shows. All over Toronto, there's obviously a vibrant and amazing Middle Eastern community. And I would call Jason often. I'd be backstage at like a wedding, and I'd be like, oh, why do I do this? I hate doing this. I'm nervous. I feel like I'm gonna throw up, and I'm just like, I hate this. I have to quit. And he would say to me, that's not nerves. It's misplaced excitement. And I mean, again, talking about what we were talking about earlier, how do we change the conversations and how do we change the lens, how we're looking at things to change a situation that maybe is unpleasant into something that's pleasurable? Mm-hmm. We can, in many cases, we are the ones who can do that.
I love that so much. Jason is wise.
He's wise.
He's so wise.
A little zen man.
If people are wondering how they can find their pleasure right now, mm-hmm. You've got a couple of simple tips,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Share those with us.
Well, one of the things, I got kind of scout around for a few things. I want everyone to take a deep breath in, and then take a deep breath out. I want you to say it. Do it again. And then, So I was doing a lot of deep breathing. And I realized how whenever I got nervous before going on air or whatever, doing that kind of deep breathing would immediately tend to calm me down. But then I thought of an acronym that the AH stands for, and I think it can be helpful when it comes to sort of starting to seek out pleasure. So the first A stands for awareness. So it's actually tuning in and thinking about the things that could possibly bring you pleasure. Like maybe it's thinking about something that brought you a lot of joy when you were a child that you no longer indulge in. Maybe that's something that you need to rediscover. Or think about what would you do if you had a completely unscheduled day? Or what would you do for a living if money was no object? So that's becoming aware of what might bring you pleasure. Another thing is, the second A is for attention. And it's like this stuff can just like slide by, you know, in the busyness of life. If you don't make time for it, if you don't pay attention to your schedule and actually carve out time to make space for doing these things that you want to do and make more pleasure. The third A is for authenticity. And it's about being honest with yourself. So sometimes pains can be masquerading as pleasures. And I can't tell you that. I don't know you, but you probably know inside yourself. If something's bugging you, if you're like, should I be doing this all the time? It's probably something you need to look at. Like I can say for myself, one of the things I've realized is that I can't have a second glass of wine. Well, I am tonight. But wine is a huge pleasure of mine, but it interrupts my sleep. And that's also a pleasure of mine. So I had to be honest with myself that I was blaming, I'm stressed, I'm aging, it's gotta be, no, it's wine.
It's the second, third glass of wine. Yeah.
So I had to realize that. And then the last letter is H, and that's help. And I think this is the biggest thing too, is that women and men, I think, don't know how to ask for help properly. Whether that's you need extra help for childcare to make space for things, whether that's you need help around the house, whether that's you need help in the bedroom. Help me out here, person I'm with. Or you need to get help in the form of therapy, asking for things to come to a deeper realization of who you are and what you want out of life.
Cyn, it's been such a pleasure, and your book is so timely. It's a roadmap to what we need right now. I think the world, there's so much going on in this world that's fraught with so much darkness right now that it's such a huge ball of light. It really is. It's beautiful. I'm proud of you, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, God, thank you.